Alrighty, guys. Hello, hello, and welcome to our virtual slides here. I'm going to be walking us through macromolecules. And macromolecules I find really fun because we eat them every single day. You might have heard of macros and micros, and that's what we're going to get into. So I'll move myself over here so that you guys can see. So below are three different structures of three different types of macromolecules. Take a moment to look at these and then I want you to pause and consider these questions here. So, what elements can you identify? So, from hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, carbon, where do we see those in these macromolecules? How are their shapes different, right? So, how is the first one different from the middle, different from this one, right? They have very clearly different shapes. And then, why do you think they are structured this way? What do you think might happen with a long structure versus a compact structure versus a more simple structure. So pause, write that information down on the slide, and then when you're ready to press play, we can keep moving on here. So first macromolecule that we're going to discuss are carbohydrates. And we probably have heard of these when we talk about our diet, right? A low carb diet, carbs, carb free, right? So carbohydrates are really important because organisms use them to store and release energy, as well as for structural support and protection. So, not necessarily something that we need to be avoiding, right? Just as everything, as we're going to learn about in this little unit here, it's moderation. So carbs are made of three elements, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So they're very simple structures. And they're always found in a 1-to-1 ratio. So the most basic form that we look at glucose, as we've seen before in the equation of respiration and photosynthesis, it's C6H12O6. If you were to divide these all by 6, then it would be 1-to-1. And so we could even see, for example, 12, 24, 12, right? So it's always going to be at a 1-to-1 ratio. And these are sources of instant energy, also known as ATP, which is the way that our body is able to turn what we eat into energy that the cells can then use. And the next unit that we learn about is going to be cells. So makes sense while we're learning about how our cells are able to take chemistry and elements and turn it into energy. So carbohydrates are one of those instant forms of energy. And because of that, our body will use glucose for both the body and the brain's main form of sugar and then therefore energy. We can use it immediately as glycogen, or we can store it for later in a form of fat. So we'll get into fat, but essentially either we use that instant energy instantly, or we store it later as a long-term form of energy in fat. We can also use carbohydrates as support or as protection. And so humans are not the only organism that ingests carbs, right? Bugs, for example, will eat carbs, they'll drink nectar and sugar, and they'll use those carbohydrates as protection. They use it in their exoskeleton. And then plants themselves make carbohydrates out of glucose, right? And they use the carbs as support. A plant's structure depends on carbohydrates. And we see that when we eat vegetables, especially as fiber. Fiber is very difficult to digest. It takes longer to break down. And so we see that in terms of how rich it is in terms of nutrients, it's very nutrient rich. There's more nutrients per calorie in fiber than there are in carbohydrates. And plants that have a more complex structure tend to have more fiber. So if you're going to eat the bark of a tree, you can't really digest that. It's almost all fiber. Meanwhile, a lettuce leaf will still have a lot of fiber, but not as much. So these are those examples that I mentioned here. We see the starch and the fiber that would make a tree bark. And then we see the chitin is what it's called when it comes to exoskeletons, is the external skeleton of a bug. So we have two main structures of carbs, mono and polysaccharides. Mono meaning one and poly meaning two. So monosaccharides are simple carbs, and we can use these as energy and as a form of structural material. So it'll either be found in DNA or as RNA. Polysaccharides, on the other hand, are covalently bonded. So remember, that means they're sharing those electrons. And these are complex carbs with various functions. So we can see starch as a support system in plants, glycogen for us as a burst of energy, and then chitin as bug exoskeletons. So you can see here the structures look very different. They're pretty easy to identify. Monosaccharide has one sugar. A disaccharide has two sugars, di meaning two. And then a polysaccharide has many in a chain. So multi, and poly meaning many, right? So here's some examples of foods that contain carbs. We have the classics that we think of, right? Sugary foods. So ice cream, bread is starchy, potatoes, rice, noodles, pasta. If you're preparing for a race or a big sporting event, you tend to carb up by eating a lot of pasta, pizza, etc. But also, we see carbs in fruits and in vegetables and in things like milk. So carbs are not always inherently unhealthy. Carbs can be very healthy to our diet. It just, like I said, is always about moderation. How much are you eating of something? So next, let's look at lipids. Lipids are the way that we refer to fats as our body uses them. So lipids can be used to store energy, and they're very important to form biological membranes, waterproof coverings, and even insulation from the cold. So lipids are very important. Fats are crucial. So same with a low carb diet, a low fat diet isn't necessarily something that everyone needs to do because by and large, we need fat, just like we need carbs. It's just moderation. So fats function as chemical messengers, which is important. That's how our cells communicate. They help insulate from the cold. So for a walrus, for example, or other big blubbery animals are going to be very well insulated from the cold because of that thick layer of extremely densely packed fat. It's like a wetsuit, keeps them nice and warm. They also help protect our organs as a cushion. That's why you have that little layer of fat over your tummy because it's protecting all of those internal organs. It's important. Phospholipids are the exterior of all of our cells. It's what we call a phospholipid bilayer. And we'll learn about this when we learn of cellular structure. But essentially, we know now that there's hydrophobic and hydrophilic substances. Our phospholipid bilayer is made of fats, which we know is hydrophobic, which tends to be the tails on the inside. And then what makes it curious is they also have a hydrophilic or a water liking, loving, etc. Part which is on the exterior. So the exterior is exposed to water, which is why it's hydrophilic. The interior is afraid of water, it's hydrophobic. And this forms the biological membrane of almost every single cell, period. So very, very important here. Fat in the brain itself is able to protect neurons and allows for electrical signals to flow. So that cell communication as well as just our nervous system being able to communicate. So fat is important, especially for our brain. Fatty brains are good brains to an extent, right? And then energy storage. So we talked about carbohydrates being that fast energy. Fats are the opposite. They are long-term energy storage. So we have 2 times the amount of calories per gram of fat than gram of protein or gram of carbohydrates. So they're very energy rich. If you were to look at, for example, a tablespoon of sugar versus a tablespoon of oil, the oil is going to have a lot more calories because it's much more energy rich. And that's why it's great for storing, right? If we need to store energy in our body's going to use it as fat so that if we end up in the wilderness with no food available to us, our body can break down that fat for energy. It's very important. And fat comes in a variety of different forms. Triglycerides are three fatty acid tails. So tri meaning three, right? They're very energy rich. We know saturated fats are commonly known as unhealthy, and these are single covalent bonds. And so because of that, they pack very tightly together. They stack on top of each other, and they are solid at room temperature. So if we think about it, if they're solid at room temperature, then they also would be solid in our bodies. So this is why we see them blocking arteries, veins, etc. That's not healthy. That's when we get into the unhealthy impacts of fat. Meanwhile, unsaturated fats are two or more double covalent bonds, which means that they're kinked, which means that they cannot pack very tightly. There's always going to be holes amongst it. So these are liquids at room temperature, which means that they are healthier in general. So if you think about it, once again, if it's a liquid, it's not going to get stuck. It's not going to block as much. So if we look at this pipe here as a visual of our arteries, if they get blocked up with that hard fat, with the saturated fats, those solid fats, eventually they can block one of our blood vessels, and that's where we get into some danger territory. But by and large, if you're eating a healthy amount of fat in a variety of different forms, saturated, unsaturated, if it comes from different foods like nuts, fish, olive oil, um, a lot of these are very healthy. Meanwhile, hamburgers, pizza, fried foods, not so healthy, right? So you don't have to be afraid of healthy fats, and you don't even have to be afraid of unhealthy fats. You just don't want to have a diet of only unhealthy fats. Moderation, variability, that's the ongoing theme here. And so I broke down some of those different types of fats for you here. Now, trans fats are kind of by and large recognized as being unhealthy, and we don't see them as often in diets anymore because we recognize that they were not very healthy, and so we've been trying to phase those out. But um, saturated fats are, like I said, even though they're technically a little bit unhealthier, they're still okay in moderation. By and large, you just think of the chemical structure. Can they pile on flat on top like bricks to make a wall? Or are there going to be holes, like if you were to put a bunch of twigs on top of each other where things can still pass through? Then that'll determine how healthy or unhealthy it is. So saturated fats stack on top, unsaturated fats are kinked, so they kind of form little gaps and holes. Okay, moving on to proteins. Now, we probably know what proteins do in terms of building muscle, but they do a lot of other stuff too. They function to control the rate of reactions and regulate our cell processes and cell structures. They transport substances in and out of cells. They help fight diseases. They help build muscle. So, a lot of uses of proteins. So, when we refer to proteins in the body, well, we're going to use the term amino acids. So, carbohydrates, lipids, which are fats, amino acids, which are proteins. And amino acids tend to get structured in either a single amino acid or linked together as a chain. And the way that our body uses amino acids is actually based off of what our DNA tells us to do. So, our DNA actually codes for, it's the recipe for different amino acids. We have 21 total different types of amino acids in the body, but the body can only make 12. We need to find the other 9 in the food that we eat. And that's so important because we need it to build new proteins. DNA and RNA are going to give us the instructions to use those proteins to then build all of the stuff that makes up our body. So, amino acids are essentially what makes up all of our body, all of the genes that we express. Our DNA is turned into proteins. So, proteins also move molecules, they send signals, they communicate throughout the body. They say hormones, for example, are different types of proteins and amino acids. And so, hormones can tell your body to do a lot of different things, such as make us feel sleepy or make us feel awake or cause hair to grow in different places if it's puberty, right? Hormones do a lot of things, but proteins are those hormones. They send those signals to our body. And our body will also use proteins from our muscles if we don't get enough in our diet to do all of those important functions. There's a bell. Let's see how fast I can wrap up here. And proteins also form enzymes, which help us break down the food that we eat. And we'll get more into enzymes because enzymes not only help us break down food, but they also help us break down different kinds of substances, materials, do certain chemical reactions, a lot of different things function in our body because of enzymes. So think of proteins as the workers for our body, for our cells. Proteins do a lot of different tasks. And they come in different structures, just like carbs and lipids do. And so, for example, those amino acids themselves have a very particular structure. They have what's known as the amino group, they have a carboxyl group, and then they have the R group. And that R group determines the identity of that amino acid, which of the 21 different types of amino acids it can be. And then based off of the amino acids, it'll determine then which of these forms it'll take. So you'll see primary structure, secondary, tertiary, quaternary. And essentially, as we move on, they get more and more complex. So primary looks like a string of beads. Meanwhile, secondary is more like a pleated sheet, like you took a piece of paper and you folded it, or like a spiral. Tertiary is kind of like a tube that is like if you were to take a long strand of clay and then swirl it on top of each other, like soft serve, and that you can just take that kind of clump, move it around. And then quaternary is multiple different clumps or tertiary structures bonded together. So some examples are keratin, which we see in rhino horn, our fingernails, our hair, actin, myosin. Those both work in having our muscles contract. And then here's some foods that have different types of proteins in them. So we know now, similar to the foods that have fat in them. And of course, same thing. Certain proteins are maybe a little bit healthier than others. And then as an example of how proteins work in our body, I wanted to show you just a very quick visual of these workers doing work in our body. So this is, well, yeah. So we don't need to get into the full video, but those proteins, those are our body's molecular machine. I'll link this video if you guys want to watch it at the end. And then finally, we get to nucleic acids. So nucleic acids are also known as our DNA or our RNA, and they store and transmit hereditary, otherwise known as genetic, information through generations. So that's how your parents passed on their genetic information to you, is through their nucleic acids, through their DNA. And so nucleic acids are known as nucleotides as well in terms of their chemical structure. They're made of 3 different components: a 5-carbon sugar, a phosphate group, and a nitrogenous base. So we'll talk a lot more about this when we get into DNA itself. But those 3 components are very important. The nitrogenous base itself is the language that our cells read to then make the proteins that determine our genetics and so on. So nucleic acids are made of multiple nucleotides all bonded together by covalent bonds. And there's 2 types that we see in nature: RNA, which is single-stranded, and DNA, which is double-stranded. So RNA is a ribonucleic acid, and then DNA is a deoxyribonucleic acid. We'll talk about that, but essentially, if you look at the structure here, you can see how they vary just a little bit between the ribose and the deoxyribose. And as I mentioned before, DNA and RNA contain the information to build proteins. They're literally the recipe or the code that our cells will use to read and then build the proteins that we need to survive. So those are macromolecules in short. Like I said, I'm going to link the video from the last slide so that you guys can watch it for more information about how proteins do work in our cells. But go ahead and take this information, and then you're going to use it on the macromolecules worksheet as you work through not only what these macromolecules do in our body, but how we can find them in our food, and then how that then communicates what purpose that food might serve for our overall existence and consumption. So I'm curious to see what recipes and ingredients and recipe labels you guys decide to use on your worksheet. If you have any questions, feel free to send me an email. Otherwise, I'll see you guys in our next class.